winter of 1971 was particularly harsh in the northern corner of Rhode Island, where the wind howled through the skeletal trees. An icy breeze swept through the barren landscape, surrounding the old Arnold Estate in the quiet town of Harrisville. The large farmhouse stood isolated against the gray sky and carried a history that was far heavier than its timber frame suggested to the naked eye. Mist clung to the frozen ground in the early mornings and obscured the edges of the property line, where the woods began their encroachment. Locals often avoided looking directly at the structure when they drove past on the country road, because legends had already taken root in the soil long before the new family arrived to claim their destiny. Roger Perron and his wife Carolyn had spent months searching for the perfect place to raise their 5 growing daughters in the peace of the country. The immense house boasted 14 rooms and sat upon 200 acres of land that seemed to stretch endlessly into the dark forest. The price was surprisingly low for such a grand property, which should have been the first sign that something was amiss with the transaction. They saw only the potential for a happy future within those walls, but the house itself seemed to watch them with ancient and unseen eyes, waiting for them to step inside. The girls were excited to explore their new kingdom, not knowing that the house held entities that claimed the space as their own. The previous owner had been brief and anxious during the final exchange of keys on that cold afternoon in January. He did not offer congratulations or warm wishes to the new owners of the expansive property. Instead, he offered a single piece of chilling advice that would haunt Roger for the rest of his life. The man leaned in close and whispered that they should leave the lights on at night for their own safety. Roger dismissed the warning as the ramblings of a superstitious countryman and focused on the task of moving his family into the home. It was a mistake that he would soon regret. As the sun began to set on their first night in the house, the first sign of trouble manifested before the family had even unpacked their boxes from the moving truck. The family dog was a large and protective animal that usually followed the girls everywhere they went without hesitation. However, the beast refused to step foot inside the farmhouse and whimpered at the threshold with its tail tucked between its legs. Roger tried to drag the animal inside to escape the biting cold, but the dog snapped and growled in pure terror. They eventually left the poor creature in the garage with plenty of food and warm blankets. The animal barked into the darkness for hours, until silence finally fell over the estate shortly after midnight. The next morning brought a grim discovery that shattered the excitement of their first day in the new home. Roger went out to the garage to check on the dog and found the animal lying stiff and cold on the concrete floor. There were no marks on the body and no signs of injury or illness that could explain the sudden death. The veterinarian could offer no medical cause for the demise of a healthy dog overnight. The loss cast a dark shadow over the family as they tried to settle into the sprawling farmhouse. It felt as though the property itself had rejected the guardian of the family and removed a barrier between the humans and the unseen. The history of the Arnold Estate was a tapestry woven with tragedy and sorrow, dating back to its construction in 1736. 8 generations of the same family had lived and died within the walls of the farmhouse and upon the surrounding land. The public records kept in the town hall told a story of suicide and poisoning and drowning that plagued the lineage for nearly 2 centuries. It was not merely a house, but a vessel for the energy of those who had passed in sudden and violent ways. The Perron family was unaware that they were stepping into a crowded room filled with spirits who had never left their earthly dwelling. The architecture of the house was strange and disorienting, with rooms that had multiple doors and staircases that seemed steep and narrow. The wooden floors creaked with every step, and the drafts that blew through the halls smelled of stagnant water and decay. Carolyn Perron began to notice that items she placed in the kitchen would vanish and reappear in different rooms moments later. She assumed at first that her daughters were playing games, or that she was simply forgetful in the chaos of the move. But the atmosphere in the house was heavy and oppressive, making simple tasks feel like walking through deep water. The silence of the house was never truly silent. The 5 Perron daughters were named Andrea and Nancy, and Christine, and Cindy, and April. They ranged in age and temperament, but they all shared an immediate sensitivity to the atmosphere of the farm. The youngest girl, April, began to speak about a new friend she had made within the first week of living there. She described a boy who appeared in her room and spoke to her quietly while she played with her dolls. The older girls dismissed it as an imaginary friend born from the loneliness of a new place. However, April insisted that the boy was real and that he was afraid of the angry lady who lived in the parents' bedroom. Small occurrences soon escalated into undeniable supernatural activity that the entire family witnessed together in broad daylight. A broom that had been leaning against the wall in the kitchen moved across the floor by itself. It did not fall over, but rather slid across the tiles as if held by an invisible hand. Carolyn watched in frozen horror as a pile of dust was swept into the center of the room before the broom fell silent. The sound of footsteps could be heard on the second floor when everyone was accounted for in the living room. It sounded like heavy boots pacing back and forth in the master bedroom directly above their heads. The entity that April called Manny seemed to be a harmless spirit who simply watched the family from a distance. The girls would often see him standing in the hallway or leaning against the door frame with a sad expression. He never spoke to them or tried to frighten them, but his presence was constant and unnerving. They learned to coexist with Manny, and even greeted him when they passed the spots where he liked to linger. But Manny was not the only spirit in the house, and the others were far less passive in their interactions with the living. The energy in the house began to shift from curious to malevolent. As the weeks turned into months, the nights became a time of terror for the girls who slept in the upstairs bedrooms down the long hallway. They would wake up to the sound of whispering voices that seemed to come from inside the walls themselves. Doors would slam shut with violent force and trap them in their rooms until Roger could force them open. Pictures on the walls would fly off their hooks and shatter on the floor without any vibration or wind to cause it. The girls started sleeping in the same room for safety, but even that offered no protection from the activity. The beds would vibrate and shake violently as soon as the lights were extinguished. A foul odor began to permeate the house at random intervals, and it smelled of rotting flesh and burning sulfur. The stench was so overpowering that it would drive the family out of the house into the winter air, gasping for breath. Roger checked the plumbing and the walls for dead rats or sewage leaks, but found absolutely nothing. The smell would vanish as quickly as it arrived and leave no trace of its source behind. It was a sensory assault that wore down their mental defenses and made them dread the simple act of breathing in their own home. The entity was marking its territory with the scent of death. The activity focused heavily on the children, at first, with unseen hands tugging at their hair and sheets. Nancy woke up one night to find an invisible force holding her down against the mattress, so she could not move. She tried to scream for her parents, but no sound escaped her throat as the pressure increased on her chest. She felt a cold breath against her ear and heard a voice tell her that she was never leaving the house. When the pressure finally released, she ran screaming into her sister's room and refused to sleep alone ever again. The physical attacks had begun, and the safety of the children was compromised. Carolyn Perron was a strong woman, but the house seemed determined to break her spirit and her mind completely. She began to feel a dark presence following her every time she entered the master bedroom or the cellar. It was not the sad watching of Manny, but a hateful glare that she could feel on the back of her neck. She would wake up with strange bruises on her arms and legs that looked like finger marks. The entity seemed to view Carolyn as a rival for the position of mistress of the house. The attacks on her were personal and vindictive, and distinct from the pranks played on the children. The breaking point for Carolyn came when she was sitting on the sofa in the living room one quiet afternoon. She felt a sudden sharp pain in her calf muscle, as if she had been stung by a large insect. She looked down to see a small puncture wound that was bleeding perfectly round and deep into the skin. There was no insect or sharp object nearby that could have caused such a specific injury. It was the first time the entity had drawn blood and marked her flesh with a physical wound. The fear that gripped the family shifted from anxiety to genuine panic about their survival. Carolyn began to research the history of the property in the local library to understand who or what was tormenting them. She discovered the name Bathsheba Sherman, who had lived on the neighboring farm in the 19th century. Bathsheba was a woman shrouded in dark rumors and accusations of witchcraft during her lifetime in the town. Local lore stated that she had been involved in the death of an infant in her care, using a large needle. The description of the needle wound matched the puncture mark on Carolyn's leg perfectly. It became clear that Bathsheba was the dominant spirit haunting the Arnold Estate. Bathsheba Sherman was described in historical records as a bitter and angry woman who was treated as a pariah. She had reportedly cursed the land and anyone who dared to live on it before her own death. The legend said she had died of a strange paralysis that turned her body to stone long before her heart stopped. Her spirit was said to be jealous of any mother who lived in the house and sought to destroy their families. Carolyn realized that she was the primary target because she was the mother of 5 children. The entity wanted to drive her out or destroy her to reclaim her dominance over the household. The family tried to maintain a semblance of normal life despite the horror that unfolded every single night. Roger would go to work and the girls would go to school, but they all dreaded the return home. They instituted a rule that no one was allowed to go into the cellar alone under any circumstances. The cellar was the heart of the darkness, where the furnace resembled a gaping mouth, and the air was always freezing. Even the spirits seemed to fear the cellar and the dark energy that pooled in the dirt floor. It was a place where the light bulbs would shatter the moment they were screwed in. The haunting became a spectacle that attracted the attention of paranormal investigators from across the region. The most famous of these were Ed and Lorraine Warren, who were contacted by a mutual friend of the family. The Warrens arrived at the farmhouse during a snowstorm and immediately sensed the overwhelming evil present. Lorraine Warren was a clairvoyant who claimed she could see the spirits clearly as she walked through the rooms. She confirmed that Bathsheba was present and that she was a demonic entity rather than a human ghost. The diagnosis was grim, and the danger was far worse than they imagined. Ed Warren interviewed the family members separately to document their experiences and build a case for an exorcism. He determined that the house was in a state of demonic infestation, which is the first stage of possession. The entities were feeding off the fear and emotional turmoil of the family to grow stronger every day. The Warrens warned Roger that leaving the house might not solve the problem if the attachment was personal. However, they agreed that an intervention was necessary to break the hold of Bathsheba over Carolyn. They planned a seance to communicate with the spirits and demand they leave. The night of the seance was a turning point that would become the most controversial aspect of the entire haunting. The Warrens brought in a medium and set up recording equipment in the living room to document the event. Carolyn was seated in the center of the circle as the vessel to contact the spirit of Bathsheba. The atmosphere in the room became heavy and electric as the medium began the incantations to summon the dead. The candles flickered violently, and the temperature dropped until everyone could see their breath in the air. Roger watched with growing unease as his wife began to tremble uncontrollably. Carolyn began to make low guttural sounds that did not belong to a human woman or any living thing. Her head snapped back and her eyes rolled up until only the whites were visible to the terrified group. She began to speak in a language that no one in the room recognized, but sounded ancient and vile. The wooden chair she was sitting on began to rock and levitate inches off the floor. The entity had taken full control of her body and was using her to mock the investigators. The power of the possession was far greater than anything the Warrens had anticipated that night. Suddenly, Carolyn was thrown from her chair across the room as if she were a rag doll. She landed in a heap in the corner, and her body contorted into unnatural positions that defied anatomy. She let out a scream that sounded like a mixture of a woman and a wild beast in pain. The girls who were watching from the top of the stairs began to scream in terror for their mother. Roger Perron had seen enough and realized that the investigation was only making the entity more violent. He rushed to his wife and demanded that the Warrens end the seance immediately. Roger was furious and punched Ed Warren in the face during the chaos, demanding they leave his house at once. He felt that the investigators had agitated the spirits and put his wife in mortal danger for their research. The Warrens were forced to leave the property that night, leaving the family alone with the angry spirits. The seance had opened a door that could not be easily closed, and the activity worsened significantly. Bathsheba was enraged by the attempt to banish her, and she took her anger out on the family. The hope of salvation had turned into a nightmare of escalation. The aftermath of the seance left the family broken and more isolated than ever before in the farmhouse. Carolyn was weak and traumatized by the possession and spent days recovering in bed while the spirits raged. The financial situation of the family was dire, and they could not afford to simply abandon the property. They were trapped in a prison of their own making, with entities that wanted them dead or gone. They had to learn to survive by keeping their heads down and ignoring the terrors around them. It was a siege mentality that lasted for years. As they saved every penny, the family developed a routine to cope with the haunting that defied all logic and reason for outsiders. They learned which rooms to avoid at certain times of the day and which spirits were dangerous. They stopped reacting to the sounds of banging and glass breaking to starve the entities of fear. It was a psychological war where the only victory was making it through the night until sunrise. The girls grew up in a house where the supernatural was as common as the weather outside. They lost their childhood innocence to the shadows that lived in the corners of their home. Eventually, the economy improved, and the family was able to secure enough money to put the house on the market. It took years to find a buyer because the reputation of the Arnold Estate was well known. They finally sold the property in 1980, which was nearly a decade after they arrived. They packed their belongings in a frenzy and did not look back as they drove down the driveway. The relief was overwhelming, but the scars of the experience were etched deep into their souls. They had survived the true horror that films would later try to replicate. On the final day of moving out, the spirits gave one last display of power to ensure they were not forgotten. As the last box was carried out, a heavy snow began to fall instantly, covering the ground. The doors of the house slammed shut in unison, creating a thunderous boom that echoed across the valley. Carolyn felt the cold stare of Bathsheba one last time from the upstairs window. As the car pulled away, the entity remained in the house, waiting for the next family to arrive and start the cycle again. The Perron family was free, but the evil was not defeated. The story of the Perron family remained a local legend for decades, until it was brought to light by the daughters. Andrea Perron wrote a trilogy of books detailing the events of those 10 years with brutal honesty. The world was shocked by the intensity and duration of the haunting compared to the famous Amityville case. While Amityville lasted only 28 days, the Perron family endured the torture for 10 long years. Many paranormal experts consider the Harrisville haunting to be the most compelling and documented case in history. It stands as a testament to the resilience of a family under siege. The farmhouse still stands today in Harrisville, and it has passed through several owners since the Perron family left. Recent owners have reported that the activity continues and that the spirits are still very much active. They offer tour and investigations for those brave enough to step inside the infamous location. The energy of the land seems to be permanent and unable to be cleansed by any ritual or prayer. It serves as a dark monument to the unknown forces that share our world just out of sight. The true horror is that some doors once opened can never be fully closed. The comparison between the Perron case and the Amityville Horror is often made by enthusiasts of the genre. Both families were large and moved into a house with a dark history only to be terrorized. However, the Perron case lacks the sensationalized violence of mass murder that started the Amityville story. Instead, It offers a slow-burning psychological terror that is perhaps more frightening because of its endurance. The parents did not run away immediately, but lived with their monsters day after day. This endurance makes their story the true horror case of the 20th century. The concept of home as a sanctuary was destroyed for the 5 girls who grew up in that environment. They carried the memories of the spirits into their adult lives and struggled to process the trauma. The bond between the sisters remains unbreakable because only they truly understand what happened in the dark. They are the witnesses to a reality that most people refuse to believe exists in the modern world. Their testimony provides a glimpse into the mysteries of death and what lingers behind. It is a burden of truth that they carry for the rest of the world. Skeptics have tried to debunk the story over the years, suggesting mass hysteria or carbon monoxide poisoning, but the physical evidence of levitation and the independent corroboration of neighbors supports the claims. The sheer number of witnesses, including police officers and contractors, adds weight to the impossible events. It is difficult to dismiss the consistent accounts of 7 people over a decade as mere fantasy. The truth is often stranger and more terrifying than any fiction an author could invent. The Arnold Estate remains a challenge to the rational view of the universe. The legacy of Bathsheba Sherman continues to loom over the pop culture landscape through films and books. While the movies took creative liberties with the facts, the core of the malevolence was portrayed accurately. The real Bathsheba was likely a complex figure whose spirit became twisted by the dark history of the land. Whether she was a witch or simply a tragic soul, her impact on the living is undeniable. She has become the face of the haunting and the symbol of the evil that waits in the dark. Her name is now synonymous with the terrifying potential of the afterlife. As night falls over Rhode Island, the old farmhouse settles into the darkness of the surrounding woods once again. The wind still howls through the trees and rattles the window panes just as it did in 1971. The lights may be on inside, but the shadows still dance in the corners of the rooms. The story of the Perron family serves as a warning to those who seek a quiet life in the country. Sometimes the price of a dream home is far higher than money can pay. The true horror is not just in the house, but in the realization that we are never truly alone. The enduring question remains regarding why such entities attach themselves to specific locations and people. Perhaps it is the energy of the land itself, or the emotional state of the living that attracts them. The Perron family was full of life and love, which may have acted as a beacon for the darkness. It suggests a parasitic relationship between the living and the dead that is uncomfortable to consider. We build our homes on the bones of the past, and sometimes the past refuses to stay buried. The boundary between the worlds is thinner than we hope. Ultimately, the survival of the family is the most remarkable part of the Harrisville haunting story. They emerged from the darkness with their lives, but they were forever changed by the experience. They faced the abyss together and managed to hold onto their sanity and their love for one another. It is a story of resilience in the face of absolute terror and the strength of the family unit. The darkness could not consume them completely because they had each other to hold on to. In the end, the light of the family was stronger than the shadow of the house. The true Amityville Horror was not in New York, but in the quiet woods of Rhode Island. It was a decade of fear that tested the limits of human endurance against supernatural forces. The Perron family proved that ordinary people can survive extraordinary evil if they refuse to give up. Their story remains the gold standard for haunted house cases in the annals of paranormal history. It whispers a chilling truth to anyone who listens closely to the wind in the trees. Some nightmares are real, and they are waiting for you to turn off the lights. As you lay in bed tonight and hear the house settle with a creak or a groan, remember them. Remember the 5 girls and their parents who listened to those same sounds with hearts pounding in their chests. Wonder if the shadow in the corner of your room is just a trick of the light or something else. The veil is thin, and the entities that walk the Arnold Estate are not unique to that one location. They are everywhere, watching and waiting for the moment we notice them standing there. Sleep well, and do not forget to leave a light on. The darkness is patient, and it has all of eternity to wait for the next invitation to enter. The story of the Perron family is closed, but the book of the supernatural remains wide open. We walk through life assuming we are the masters of our domain, but we are merely guests. The true landlords are the spirits who were here before us and will remain long after we are gone. Respect the shadows and heed the warnings of history, lest you become part of the legend yourself. The end of the story is only the beginning of the next haunting.